I wanted to reintroduce you to Bulent Atalay. Last time I spoke about, and he spoke about his experience with fusion. And this time we're going to hear a totally different aspect of Bulent's interest. People have called him a modern day Renaissance man, and he certainly is. He is author of the best-selling book Math and the Mona Lisa, The Art of Science of Leonardo da Vinci, and subsequently been translated into 13 languages, and a more recent book, Leonardo's Universe, The Renaissance World of Leonardo da Vinci. He co-authored that with Keith Wemsley, and he's regarded by National Geographic Books, released by them and regarded highly. It's been listed among Encyclopedia Britannica's blog as 10 must-have reference books from 2008. He's also a blog writer for the National Geographic Newswatch. We're really honored and delighted to have Bulent speak to us again today, just a week after his previous discussion on fusion. And by the way, these are being recorded and are being posted remarkably quickly by the good, well-skilled people at Plato. And so you'll find this if you go on the Plato log probably in another day or two, and I might be able to send you a link to it, but I think you'll be able to find it yourself. So without further delay, I give you the screen and microphone, Bulent, and I look forward so much to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Richard. Now, can you see me in the speaker or gallery view?
Yes.
Am I on the screen? Oh, all right, very good. Good luck with your surgery.
Thank you.
I went through that a few years ago, and you'll be incomparably happier without the glasses.
Yes.
As I mentioned to you earlier, my wife is looking forward to having her surgery, but she hasn't taken prednisone the way I did that expedited the need.
Yeah, it does.
And Richard and I met on a cruise in 2016. We were sailing, I believe, from Miami to Barcelona.
Yes.
And it was a wonderful cruise. We became friends, and he invited us to Madison, where I gave a couple of talks, one in his home. The one I gave in his, and the other one for the Plato Society in a bank. The one I gave in the home, however, was on my new book, No Ordinary Genius. Let me just get these out of the way very quickly. The book he mentioned is Math and the Mona Lisa, which was a lot of fun writing. It wasn't the title I had for the book originally, but marketers and this is the Smithsonian book. The marketing department is far better than the authors in selecting names. Mm-hmm. And they came up with Math and the Mona Lisa with the wonderful alliteration. And in the cover, the remarkable thing, they took the Mona Lisa painting, the portrait, and superimposed it on a page of Leonardo's codices. Mm. And in one corner, this is astonishing. This is just by luck. In one corner, right up here, is the design of a reflecting telescope. That's 170 years before Isaac Newton invented the reflecting telescope.
Hmm. Wow.
The other book was the National Geographic book. It's this one.
Nice.
This did very nice, very well. Leonardo sells. Leonardo sells very well because we're fascinated with someone who can be so good in so many different fields. As a matter of fact, in the manuscript of the new book, No Ordinary Genius, I extracted one little excerpt from the book for this purpose, for his prescience. Leonardo prefigured Copernicus's understanding of the heliocentric universe, that is, that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. It was a planet like the other 8 planets. In those days, they knew about 6 planets. He prefigured Copernicus by 30 years. He prefigured Galileo's discovery of constant gravitational acceleration by 110 years. You see, Aristotle had it wrong. He used to say heavy objects fall faster than light objects. And it does take a remarkable insight to realize it's air resistance that slows down the lighter objects more. Galileo discovered this in the early 17th century, but Leonardo already knew about this in the early 16th century, late 15th century. He prefigured William Harvey's theory of the circulation of blood by 120 years. He prefigured Newton's creation of the reflecting telescope by 160 years. He prefigured Darwin's theory of evolution by 350 years. He talked about how organisms have to evolve. He prefigured Viennese surgeons' recognition of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, by 400 years, and robotics by 450 years. What we always thought was a spring-powered cart turns out to be the first example of robotics in history. Yet on his deathbed, he would turn to his assistant Malsey and muse, "Did anything get done?" Meanwhile, we stand in awe and wonder, were there a dozen different supreme geniuses all using the same name, Leonardo da Vinci? Was he the greatest mind? Was the greatest mind of the Renaissance also the greatest genius of all? After all, he did have a significant advantage, waking up so early. As Freud said, Leonardo da Vinci was like a man who awoke too early in the darkness while the others were still asleep. Well, certainly he has fascinated philosophers, historians, scientists, writers, painters, all through the centuries. 2 years ago, 2019 was the 500th anniversary of his death. And we were going on a cruise. My wife and I took our last 2 of our 6 grandchildren on a cruise from Amsterdam to Barcelona. I was giving lectures on the Crystal Serenity, and the ship stopped for 2 nights in Bordeaux. That gave us a chance to take a high-speed train to tour northwestern France in the Loire Valley, the Chateau country. You see, Leonardo spent the last 3 years of his life living as the how should I say, well, he was the guest of Francis I, Francois Premier, and a house was a large house, a small chateau was acquired for him, procured for him by Francis. He set up shop there, he painted, he did experiments in science, in physics, in chemistry, in biology, and everything else. But he also had a stroke. The stroke was in the left hemisphere of his brain, which partially paralyzed his right side. He was left-handed, so he could still draw and paint with his left hand, but he complained about how without the loss of his right hand, he no longer had creativity. He didn't have the remarkable prescience that he had before. So it appears that you need both sides of both hemispheres of the brain, not only for analysis, but for creativity. Generally, psychologists or psychiatrists tell us that the left hemisphere of the brain is used for science, for mathematics, for physics, for chess, and the right side for writing, for poetry, for acting. Isaac Newton, one of my 5 no ordinary geniuses, obviously had that remarkable mathematical ability. He created, hello, Leah. so he created calculus, and he was remarkable in his mathematics. So was Einstein. But Leonardo, on the other hand, was so good on both sides. He had a functionally symmetric brain in that sense. What I'm going to do is start showing some slides and let the slides dictate the flow of the lecture. So I'll see what I can do with sharing the screen. Tried earlier.
Perfect. Very good.
Are you leaving now?
Yep, everything's just right.
Okay, you see one slide now, right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. This is my Plato lecture. I hope to give it to American University and the University of Virginia in a couple of weeks. So the cover of the new book is a little different. In the new book, I have, let me see if you can see that, the signatures of the great geniuses. This is Vincent Van Gogh. Here's Heisenberg, Jane Austen, Ernest Hemingway. But the 5 who I concentrate on are Leonardo da Vinci, Shakespeare, Newton, right here, Beethoven, and Albert Einstein. They are the transformative geniuses, or who've defined the expression genius. Over my long career in physics, I've known 29, in fact, 30 Nobel Prize winners. All of them are clever, far more clever than I am. Of the 29 or 30, 2 of them transcend the others. One of them was Dick Feynman, who many of you have probably heard of. And the other one was his personal hero, Paul Dirac, who you'll never hear of. In fact, students may get an undergraduate degree in physics and never hear of him. But if they do a degree in a doctorate in physics, they can't avoid his name. He gave us quantum mechanics as we know it. Now, these are the 5, the transformative geniuses that I'm speaking of. They transcend even the Dirac and the Feynman. They define their fields. No one can argue that Shakespeare was the finest writer in any language, maybe the finest psychologist, practical psychologist in any language. Isaac Newton, the greatest mathematician, the greatest physicist in history. Now, you can get an argument about the greatest composer. Was it Bach or Mozart or Beethoven? I make a case for Beethoven as the rebel, the destroyer creator of music. And he's a psychopathological twin of Newton right next to him here in the picture, a series of pictures. The definition of genius, very simple. Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher who Einstein used to read with great pleasure, described genius as talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Now, even he did not really comprehend the transformative genius, the Leonardo da Vinci. In this sketch, this is an ink drawing of Eugene Wigner. I did the drawing at Princeton in the I think I did it back in the 1970s. He had lost his wife just recently, and we were sitting across the table from each other. He had been my advisor, and it was a genius. He was one of the famous Martians of Hungary, of Budapest. These are 5 students who came out of, actually 7 students who came out of Gymnasium 19, the evangelical school in Budapest. He won his Nobel Prize in 1963, and he lived right down the street from Einstein. Now, that mug of Einstein is a sketch, my sketch of Einstein that I actually did based on a photograph of Yusuf Karsh. Yusuf Karsh was one of the finest photographers of his generation, portrait photographers. And in 1947, he had done this portrait, a photographic portrait. But in the portrait, Einstein was looking in the other direction, to the right. I took the portrait and put a rubber band down the middle vertically. Whatever I saw on the right, I drew to the left. So mathematically, I projected one side to the other. And then for the Einstein Centennial in 1979 at the Institute for Advanced Study, they used this sketch for a poster, and the Einstein House in Bern, Switzerland, the museum, made a cup out of it. The person blowing the cup here is William Phillips, Nobel laureate 1997. It's symbolic that he's cooling the coffee down by blowing on it, because in reality, he won the Nobel Prize for creating temperatures of micro Kelvin. Actually, even 10 to the minus 12 degrees or pico Kelvin by trapping atoms with lasers. We thought, at least when I was a student, I thought that the temperature of 3 degrees in the universe was the coldest we could ever achieve. But it turns out you can get even colder than that by trapping atoms, stopping them. In space, there was just enough light and atoms to create that temperature of 3 degrees above absolute zero.
Just a quick check, Bulent. Are you still on slide 2, or have you moved on?
There should be numbers on the slides. Let me see. Are you seeing? This is slide 5 and 6.
Okay. I'm only seeing slide 2 with all the signatures.
Oh, I wonder why. Let me go on.
Okay, now I see Leonardo's face.
Okay, this is not in play view. Let me increase this. I'm glad you brought this up. Okay, yeah, now I'm going to put this on play. Let's see what happens here. Do you see a slide?
Yes, I see Leonardo's face enlarged.
Okay, we're now in play mode.
Good. Yeah, I had a feeling we were missing some slides. Excellent. Good.
Okay, everyone recognizes the picture here. There's a carving at Kennedy Center in Washington. It's on the terrace level. There's a connection between achievement in public life and progress in the arts. The age of Pericles was also the age of Phidias. The age of Lorenzo de' Medici was also the age of Leonardo da Vinci. The age of Elizabeth was also the age of Shakespeare. And the new frontier for which I campaign in public life can also be a new frontier for American art. He had written this to a journalist who had asked him what art meant to him shortly before he took over the presidency. This is the idea of zeitgeist. Zeitgeist, or the cultural mood, the cultural spirit of a society is really important for art. And Pericles had created that culture, the zeitgeist, for the Parthenon to be created, with Phidias, the finest sculptor of antiquity, to carve those friezes. Lorenzo de' Medici is symbolic of the Medicis, who created the High Renaissance in Italy. Elizabeth I, that is, for creating the zeitgeist for Shakespeare. Now, Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, vied for the same spirit. Of course, Kennedy's life ended with the assassination in November 1963. He never saw that Renaissance, but in a sense, he did leave behind that Camelot feeling. He rejuvenated the youth, and there was the spirit that took us to the moon just 10 years later in 1969. There was also the spirit of arts. The last administration, unfortunately, tried to cut back on the endowment for the humanities, but fortunately, it's been restored. Now, England spends 10 times more money on the arts, supported by the government, but in the last administration, it almost ceased. Now, some of the properties of genius, these are things that the difference between ordinary and transformative, many of the geniuses I've known, the Nobel Prize winners, are indeed geniuses. My good friend Alan Fletcher, who is a composer and a conductor, he's the head of the Aspen School of Music. Rather than just the ordinary and the transformative, he put in there two other categories: ordinary, transitional, summative, and transformative. And at least for music he did. He had heard this one lecture I gave in Aspen, and he put in the ordinary category Haydn and Vivaldi. In the summative category, he put Mozart, and in the transformative category, he put in Beethoven and Bach. That's the most important. And he also added to that Richard Wagner, although Richard Wagner will always be a little controversial because he was a great anti-Semite.
Mm-hmm.
The factors of intelligence, again, in my book, I take a very simple series of criteria. There has to be an intelligence, there has to be the creativity. One without the other is not very useful. And there has to be something left behind. If you leave behind the Sistine ceiling, you have left behind a supreme immortal legacy, as Michelangelo did. Mm-hmm. If you leave behind calculus, some students might not be very happy with it, but you have left behind the most important branch of mathematics that Isaac Newton did. All the characteristics of aversion to authority are in fact necessary for genius. There has to be a relentless grit. It turns out left-handed people, I can't see any pictures, any of you in this on the screen, but perhaps you can raise your hand if you're left-handed. Raise your left hand. They have a slight edge. 4 of the 5 geniuses I look at are left-handed. It might be that they're more resourceful. 4 of 5 turn out to be gay. That might be one of the characteristics of independence and aversion to authority. In the mathematical sciences, the younger you are, the better. You will reach your peak in your 20s. Newton was 23. Dirac, who I mentioned earlier, was 23. Einstein was an old man of 26 when he had his miracle year in 1905. But the transformative geniuses, the truly, the ones who surpass the others, do peak their peak, or they reach their peak early, and then they have rebirths. It's not just a one-time creation, but in the case of Newton, he had one in 1665 during the pandemic year in England, 1665, 1666, Cambridge University, where he had just graduated, was closed down, and he went to his hometown in Woolsthorpe, about 60 miles north of Cambridge. And he came back to his old advisor and showed him his list of mental inventions. He had essentially created physics and calculus. 23 years later, when he was 46, he published it in the most important scientific book in history, the so-called Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, the Principia. Anyway, I go on. I'll let the slides dictate the flow again. The zeitgeist factor. There is this factor of great teachers truly inspiring great minds. The parable of Laszlo Ratz is about Eugene Wigner, whose sketch you saw earlier. These were all characters born around 1902 in the class of 40 students in Gymnasium 19. There was Eugene Wigner. There was Eugene Ormandy. You might remember Eugene Ormandy as the finest conductor of his time. He made the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra the best orchestra in the world in the 1940s and 50s. There was Johnny von Neumann in the class, without a doubt the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. There was also in there André Szilard, known as the father of the atom bomb. There was Edward Teller. There was Albert Szent-Györgyi. 7 of the 40 won prizes. They won Nobel Prizes, Fields Medals. And I used to go to Wigner's office at Princeton, and on his wall, there were 3 portraits hanging. In the new physics building, Jadwin Hall. 2 of them I could recognize immediately. One was Isaac Newton. The second one was Albert Einstein, his hero, who lived right down the street from him in Princeton, in fact. And I used to ask him, what was in the water in Budapest? And he would always point at picture number 3. That was Laszlo Ratz. Laszlo Ratz was his mathematics teacher. He had inspired Johnny von Neumann and Eugene Wigner and all the others. At the bottom I mentioned there is this miracle year, or annus mirabilis, always present in these transformative geniuses. Now, I'm looking at some modern day innovators. My wife is not always very happy that I show this particular slide, but among modern innovators, you're going to see their names appear.
We're still on Leonardo's face.
Oh
Yeah.
my, I don't know what's happening. I'm going to have to do it this way in that case. Do you see a single slide?
Yes, modern day innovators.
Okay, let me try this play slideshow in window again. Let's see where it goes. Do you see it? One white screen?
Yes,
with
but
names
we're still on modern day innovators, the age of billionaires.
Okay, good. But are names appearing? Is this animated?
No.
How about this? You don't see anything. In that case, I'm going to have to show, I won't play it in animated form, but just show the slides in that case.
Yes, that would be fine.
Yeah, I'll see if I can make it just slightly larger. Does this fill your screen better?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Okay.
I'm going to shrink us a little bit too. I'm going to shrink our images. Okay.
Okay. Edwin Land and Alan Turing came before the modern day innovators. Edwin Land went to Harvard, but of course he dropped out after his freshman year. He invented the Polaroid camera.
Yes.
Alan Turing, mathematician. You must see the film, The Imitation Game, if you haven't seen it. After receiving a degree in mathematics at St. John's College, Oxford, or King's College, Cambridge, King's College, Cambridge, he came to the United States and did a doctorate at Princeton University. He received his doctorate and he wrote a famous thesis on cybernetics and even on artificial intelligence. He received all his degrees. Now, if you can see my cursor, that's what this check means here. Can you see a cursor?
Yes.
Okay, he finished his degree. Edwin Land dropped out as a freshman. Larry Ellison, billionaire. 2 years ago, before the pandemic, he was worth 61 billion. I think he's probably worth more because it turns out modern innovators were positioned to get richer and richer, even in times of pandemics.
What does the DO stand for again?
Dropout.
Okay. Okay.
He dropped out of his graduate degree.
Okay.
Steve Wozniak attended UC Berkeley. He dropped out. He became a partner of Steve Jobs, who's here.
Yeah.
Another dropout. As a matter of fact, they're all dropouts if you look at this. Timothy Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, the internet. He stayed on at Oxford and received his bachelor's and then his MA with a first in physics. A first in Oxford and Cambridge are the same as our summa cum laudes. It was brilliant, but he didn't make any money on it. He simply gave it gratis to the world, good or bad. Steve Jobs, dropout, 1 year at Reed College and Reed College in Oregon or Washington State, I think. Jeff Bezos, Princeton, finished his degree. Elon Musk, dropout. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they created Google, both the same age. The reason for their almost symmetry in great wealth. Michael Dell and Mark Zuckerberg, all dropouts. If you have great ideas, it's all right to drop out. After I published Math and the Mona Lisa, a year or two later, I had a call from a young man, a student, a high school student in Fresno, California. He had graduated from high school first in his class. He was a brilliant kid, but he didn't want to go on to college because he said, look at these dropouts there. It's much better to be a dropout than not attend an institution in the first place. And he said he and his parents made a deal that they would leave the advice to me. I didn't even know the young man. They wanted him to go on to college and he didn't want to, so he could invent. And my advice is, it's going to be 1 in a billion that you can make it without a great education. Get the education first and then do what you will. I haven't heard from him anymore. I hope he finished his degrees. In any event, next slide. Let me go on to the next slide. Okay. 2 years ago, when we were in Florence, and it was the 500th anniversary of Leonardo's death, we met friends who had come in from Israel. 50 years ago, we were at Oxford together, and they came from Israel, we came from the States, from Virginia, and we met in Florence. Then we drove up to Milan, and in Milan at the museum and library called the Ambrosiana, we saw this famous cartoon. Now, what a cartoon is patched together pieces of sketches. They're assembled as they're glued together at the edges and made into a very large sheet the size of the painting to be. This is Raphael's School of Athens cartoon. I believe it's about 13 feet. It might be more from end to end. And among these characters are the great philosophers of roughly 1,500 years. Pythagoras right here. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. This is Pythagoras. He's doing geometry. There's someone looking over his shoulder. There is Heraclitus, or sorry, this is Parmenides, and right next to him, a woman, Hypatia. I go to the next slide. There's a red X here, and there's another one here. There are 2 missing characters. You see, when when Raphael was painting this in Rome, he had created this cartoon and taken a pin and made pinholes all along the shadows, the outline of each of the figures, so it could be made into one large painting. You take a muslin bag full of charcoal dust and you punch it against the wall. You essentially stencil the cartoon onto the wall. Michelangelo saw it in this form, and he was very upset that he wasn't depicted with the other geniuses, while his rival Leonardo was. So I go
Where's
to the next
Leonardo?
slide.
Where's Leonardo in here?
Leonardo is in there.
Okay.
Let me see if I can show this. This is tragic if I can't show it. Leonardo is here as Plato.
Okay.
And this person is the master of perspective for the Renaissance, Sangiato. He represents Aristotle. Now, in the next slide, what I'm going to have to do is reproduce the slide very quickly, as I just did. And in this one, remove these single pictures so you can make this thing. Wow. Since animation doesn't work, the picture should be coming together now.
Yeah.
Okay, there it is. There is Leonardo. There is as Plato. There is Aristotle. In order to satisfy Michelangelo, Raphael, seen right there, painted Michelangelo into the painting as the philosopher Heraclitus. What Michelangelo didn't know was Heraclitus was a very, very difficult man and misogynist, and he thought that was very appropriate for Michelangelo. It's a little private joke on Michelangelo. But he also painted himself, which is really wonderful. This is Euclid teaching his students geometry, Diogenes, Socrates is here in the painting. Then in the next slide, each of these were animated and blown up. There are Plato and Aristotle. This might be a good symbol, a good logo for your organization, Richard. Well, Hypatia, the only woman in the picture, but a very significant mathematician and astronomer from the 5th century. She was the last librarian of the Library of Alexandria. There is Euclid, Pythagoras. This is Michelangelo, of course, as Heraclitus. We don't know who the model is for Euclid here. But this, again, is a close-up of Raphael. Now, modern School of Athens is this. I showed this last week when I spoke about fusion energy. The picture was taken in 1927. It featured the greatest scientists of the period, the pioneers of modern science. The front row is comprised of the old school, in a sense, the Old Testament. They represent classical physics, deterministic physics. The second and third row, among them are 5 or 6 individuals, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Pauli, and Dirac. This is Dirac. If you take the diagonals of the picture identify Dirac. He was 25 in the picture, just like Heisenberg was 25 in the picture. And they're identified below. This is Niels Bohr. If you have some science background, you would know Niels Bohr, the father confessor of quantum mechanics, one of Einstein's close friends, who gave us the physics of the atom. And right next to him is Max Born. Max Born won the Nobel Prize in 1954, much later than the old school, but he became more famous as the grandfather of Olivia Newton-John than for the physics he invented. This is a later year, 1933 Solvay conference. In the first book, when I talked about math and the Mona Lisa, I think if you see me in the small picture, this is the math and the Mona Lisa. I talked about the mathematics that went into Leonardo's paintings. This is the golden rectangle. You start with a square. You take a compass. First you take the square and you bisect it. Right down the middle, you draw a line. You take a compass, you put the needle of the compass here and the pencil here. Now you swing an arc. You extend the horizontal line at the bottom, you extend the horizontal line at the top, and you complete the square. This is the golden rectangle. Its proportions are 1 part to 1.618. I have my wallet on me, which is fortunate. I usually don't carry it around, but here is a golden rectangle. It's made to appeal to us. Richard, are you there?
I am, and I'm looking for your picture. Did you pull out a dollar bill?
No, I actually pulled out a credit card.
Oh, okay.
You see it?
I don't see the credit card.
You do see it? Or
No,
you don't?
I just see the golden rectangle. I'm looking at my credit card. I don't see a golden triangle.
You'd have to see me in the picture. You'd have to see here. I'll depart just for a second.
Sure. Okay.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
That's the golden rectangle.
Oh, that's the chip.
It's the shape of the.
Just the shape of the card.
Yes.
Okay.
It's made to appeal to us. Now I'll go back to the slides. We were right there.
Here we are.
A golden rectangle held in vertical format. You can draw the diagonals of the square on top and the diagonals of the rectangle. The area right here is the golden area of the golden rectangle. That's where the head would go in a portrait. You can construct a logarithmic spiral. Of all the spirals in nature, there are many, many spirals. This is the one that appeals to us. It's called the logarithmic spiral. In the golden rectangle, you have the square. Here's a second square. Here's a third square. Here's a fourth square and a fifth square. It's sometimes thought of as the tumbling squares. You connect the first vertex to the third vertex, skip this one to the fifth vertex, skip this to the seventh vertex, skip this ninth vertex. This shape is the logarithmic spiral, the shape that nature likes. Leonardo discovered it. So had the Pythagoreans 2,500 years ago. The Pythagoreans had discovered it by using this geometry. Well, the equation for that spiral in polar coordinates is right here. R equals, it's also the same equation that gives us the radioactive decay law.
Oh, yeah.
This would be n of t, n sub o, minus natural log of the half-life and time. Next slide. The Parthenon is exactly inscribed in a golden rectangle. When you have the pediment included, it becomes a logarithmic spiral. Going back to Pericles, you remember, he's the man who carved the pediment for the Parthenon. He and his friends, the architects Callicratus and Ictinus, had realized that if you have perfectly straight lines, here's a straight line. I take my cursor and I sweep it across. That's a straight line. What he said was, a straight line will look like it's sagging, the way it does in this picture of the Parthenon. That's because the horizon on the Earth is a convex curvature. You see it this way as a convex curvature. So to defeat the optical illusion, they built the Parthenon, Pericles, Callicratus, and Ictinus, with a convex curvature at the bottom. It's been magnified here. It's not. It certainly looks like a straight line. Now, here's what the Parthenon looks like now, when the golden rectangle is superimposed on it. The shape of a DNA molecule in one cycle, as if you flatten the double helix, in one cycle of the sine wave, it'll be one part here to 1.618. I go to the next slide. This is not a logarithmic spiral. This is an Archimedean spiral. It's at a local Starbucks. This is the logarithmic spiral. This is the spiral that nature likes, the chambered nautilus.
Yes.
Here is a 160 million year old ancestor of the logarithmic spiral. On that cruise we made in 2019, our ship stopped in Honfleur, which you would probably know, in the very close to Belgium on the coast is the resort town of Honfleur.
Yes, yes, I know it. Lovely art there.
Beautiful place. Well, when we were there, it was lunchtime, and I saw these two ancient, obviously logarithmic spirals in the window. I didn't think I could afford it, but I took a picture of the window and I left. Well, that haunted me the next month or two. And I went to Google Maps and I found the shop on Google Maps. I went along all the streets and I finally found the picture in a window. And I identified the store. I haggled with the owner of the store selling relics. And it's, what is it, 195 euros for the pair, 110 for each.
Yeah.
There it is. So it's now in my home, in the bookcase behind me.
Lovely.
There. This is a logarithmic spiral. Now, what's the logarithmic curve? Oh, sorry. There is a logarithmic spiral right there. It's a pair of them. It's always interwoven pair of logarithmic spirals. You see, here's one, here's the other, here's the other.
So gravity is affected by the same principles. Nice.
Exactly. They're both inverse squared. The electrical forces, 1 over r, are 1 over the distance square. So is the gravitational force 1 over the distance square.
Yeah.
So the spiral is the spiral of nature, ultimately. Aryabhata, who in the 6th century invented the zero. The ancients, the great mathematicians who did geometry, and even Archimedes, of course, the greatest mathematician and scientist of antiquity, he lived in Sicily, was not able to invent calculus because the zero was missing. The zero was finally introduced in the mathematics by the Indian mathematician Aryabhata in 499 AD. He would have been 23. The statue is in India again. Let me just, in 1202, the mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci from Pisa, educated in Morocco at the University of Fez, went back to his hometown, Pisa, and wrote a book. The book was called the Liber Abaci. You can see the name at the bottom of the page. This is an illuminated page. For the first time in history, the series 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 15 appear. You see, this is the Fibonacci sequence that we've all been taught, usually in the 10th or 11th grades. In his case, he had this book, he published this book in 1202, and in the book, he said the Arabs have this number called zero, and he proposed the decimal system based on the zero that came from the Arabs, and before the Arabs, the Hindus, and he taught algebra with it. The book was full of algebra problems. In the last chapter of his book, chapter 15, he had this problem, a book nowadays we would call this the Mathematics of Combinatorics. He said, suppose you have a pair of rabbits here. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't animate them here. He said, suppose you have, I'll just leave this slide up for the first time being. You have a room and you have one pair of rabbits, but the rabbits have to mature for 2 months before they can give rise to new rabbits. So the first month, it's still one pair of rabbits. In the second month, it's still one pair of rabbits because they haven't sufficiently matured. In the next month, it'll be 2 pairs because 1 pair will be born. In the following month, you will have new pairs coming into maturation, and the numbers will be 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Nowadays, in geometry classes or algebra classes in high school, you'll see that these are just the sum of the pairs of elements. 1 plus 1 gives you 2, 2 plus 1 gives you 3, 2 plus 3 gives you 5, 8, 13, 21, etc. Nature's numbers. Leonardo da Vinci learned them on his own or invented them on his own. Now, coming back to Leonardo da Vinci, he was left-handed and he would always write from the right to the left. He didn't have any education, he had to teach himself, but being a left-hander, he thought it was much more practical to write from right to left because the pen would not stab the paper and he would not smudge the ink. So here is one of his statements rendered into English. I guess if you had dyslexia, you could read this much easier, but you can flip this. The first word here is nature, being, inconstant. Leonardo's own font, which I can flip. Nature being inconstant and taking pleasure in creating, continually producing new forms, because she knows that her terrestrial materials are thereby augmented, is more ready and more swift in her creating than is time and its destruction. He's talking about evolution. The first time evolution is ever mentioned in history. In 1482, Leonardo was out of a job in Florence. He wrote a letter to the Duke of Milan, 200 miles to the north, and he lived in the palace, the ducal palace of Sforza. And in the letter he had written, this was essentially a CV. He talks about what he's already done, and then he changes his tense to what he thinks he can still do. He says, I can build an armored vehicle. I can build it with springs. I can build a steam-powered cannon. You see, he's heard that Duke Sforza is after a military engineer, and he's applying for a job as a military engineer. He talks about the possibility of making flying machines. And at the very end, he writes, I also paint. So Leonardo also paints. Well, 20 years later, he wrote another letter. This time the letter was written to Turkey. Taking advantage of being able to write from right to left, he wrote this in Turkish to the Sultan of Turkey, Bayezid II. The waterway here is the Bosphorus. This is the Black Sea up there and the Sea of Marmara. And he said, I understand that from Turkish merchants that you're trying to build a bridge over the Golden Horn. This is the Golden Horn section of the Bosphorus. And he says, I understand you haven't been able to find an engineer who can build a single arch bridge. Well, I am your man, he says. And in the last words of the letter, he says, I also paint. Well, there's his bridge. Unfortunately, in this last letter, the letter came from Italy to Turkey, but it was sent by way of Genoa, from ships that were leaving from Genoa bound for Constantinople. The scribe who must have received it in the palace in Turkey, in Constantinople, wrote, the Kafir Ricardo of Genoa. Kafir is an unbeliever, a non-believer, a Christian. Ricardo, he has the name wrong. He doesn't have Leonardo of Florence. Leonardo didn't get the job. 500 years later, his bridge was built in Norway. This is what Leonardo had in mind. Can you see this all right, Richard? Or
Yes,
Louise?
we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. It's a bridge made of parabolic supports underneath. The mathematics of the parabola was not worked out till the 19th century, and yet here's Leonardo with his remarkable insight and prescience designing this bridge. Here's my manuscript. This is the last book. And Math and the Mona Lisa did very well. It got translated into many languages, including, except this one here is from Mad Comics. It's a placekeeper. Now, the modern day genius, as I mentioned earlier, there's Steve Jobs on the left. In the last chapter of my new book, I speak about the revolution, the information age we're living in. And of course, Steve Jobs was a major player. He gave us the possibility of putting computers on our desks and even in our hands. I can write about geniuses who've died, but geniuses who are still living, I think we have to wait for some 50 years or so before we can decide. But Elon Musk certainly seems to qualify. He has the aversion to authority. There's Alan Turing, who gave us the mathematics of cybernetics. A tincture of madness. Ever since the Greeks and the Romans, we've essentially understood that to be really a genius, to be that creative and live outside the box, you have to have some things that is wrong with you. Paintings, the creator of art is frequently reflecting his own psyche. Hieronymus Bosch, who lived in Holland and Germany in the time of Leonardo, gave us paintings like this. This was the painting called the Earthly Divines. Edward Munch certainly was was suffering when he gave us this painting, The Scream, and Pablo Picasso. A good friend of mine is the psychiatrist on the left, Arnold Ludwig, and he's at Brown University, retired, and his son, who was a very good artist, painted his father for his Father's Day present and created Picasso, painted a Vincent Van Gogh painting of him after Van Gogh, of course, had cut off his ear, mutilated his ear. Oh, incidentally, in this famous painting, the original painting by Van Gogh, he cut off his left ear. As we see the painting, it's his right ear because he's looking into a mirror. And all artists who've done a self-portrait know this. You're looking into a mirror and it's exactly the opposite. In this case, it's Daniel Ludwig's admonishment to his father to stop the smoking. Vincent Van Gogh, of course, did this painting, the Starry Night, the centerpiece of the MoMA collection in New York. He was in an insane asylum where he had committed himself, looking through the bars in the window, and it's a steeple and swirls and spirals are sometimes indicative of the same thing that Leonardo saw and was fascinated by, the spirals. Oh, here's a later date comic genius. This is Robin Williams, who committed suicide. I think it must have been in 2004. Yes, 2014, he committed suicide. This picture I took at St. Andrew's School in Delaware. They made the Dead Poets Society there. This is my son, Michael, and my daughter, Janine. Mr. Williams and Peter Weir, the director of the movie. Committing suicide, of course, is pretty much a last resort, last statement by a deeply disturbed individual. Earlier, I showed you the Fibonacci series, and I showed it to you by taking rabbits in an enclosure. It turns out, if you look at a tree will branch first into a pair of branches like this, and then halfway up the next cycle, one of the two branches will bifurcate or branch, the other one will not. In the next cycle, this one doesn't branch, but this branch does into two. This branch comes up and branches into two. In the next cycle, this will branch, this will branch, one of these two will branch, but it's always, at any given level, it's a Fibonacci number. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Ultimately, it has to do with the division of cells. Here is a very nice oak tree, a cork oak from Portugal. It's now 12:10 almost. I'll stop with the next couple of slides. In this triptych, three pictures together, you see the sketch of Leonardo for his painting, The Virgin of the Rocks, the angel. Now, the first thing you see here, at least as an artist, the first thing I see here is that the shading has negative slope. It goes from top left to bottom right. This is indicative of a left-hander. No right-hander can shade this way. Only left-handers have negative slope. As an artist, when I sketch, I always have positive slope because I put the heel of my hand down and make swirling pattern, make shading patterns. Well, after Leonardo created this drawing, now called the most beautiful drawing ever made of a woman, he painted the head, the Virgin of the Rocks, the angel, her beautifully curled hair, curls in her hair. They happen to be logarithmic spirals, and that's what they are in Leonardo's, that's what they are in nature. Hair is not circular Archimedean spirals, but they're logarithmic spirals. And in the second version of the Virgin of the Rocks, he painted the one on the right. And that inspired 150 years later, another one of the greatest painters in history, certainly among my 4 or 5 favorite, Vermeer, and the girl with the pearl earring. Leonardo's drawing of the heart. There's a a famous surgeon at Cambridge University, Paps Hospital, who does mitral valve repairs based on drawings and notes of Leonardo da Vinci. Francis Wells is the surgeon. My son, who's an MD, PhD in medicine and physics, produced this, the picture on the right with his CAT scan, and he gave it to me in video form so I could rotate it, and I took a capture slide in the configuration that I had the Leonardo pictures. There's that again. Let me stop here because I know I'll run out of time if you have questions. Please go ahead and ask questions. And meanwhile, while I receive questions, I can show you a few more slides. Based on proportions of the face that Leonardo published, the ideal shape and proportions of the face, as a Los Angeles dentist slash aesthetic surgeon. He was first a dentist, then he became an aesthetic surgeon, came up with a mask based on the Fibonacci numbers and the golden proportions given by Leonardo. Now, this is the mask that Dr. What is it? It'll come to me in a minute. Marquardt is the dentist, aesthetic surgeon. It fits perfectly on the face of the timeless beauty Nefertiti. It fits perfectly on the face of Aspasia, who was the girlfriend of Pericles. This is the Cowper Madonna by Raphael. It's the National Gallery in Washington. This is Lady Agnew at the National Gallery, also National Gallery of London. And my students nowadays would not recognize the two beauties at the bottom. This is Marlena Dietrich. This is Marlena Dietrich. Again, the spacing between the eyes, the proportions. And the last one, Marilyn Monroe. The height of the forehead compared to the height of the nose is 1 to 1.618. The nose compared to the upper lip is 1 to 1.618. This is the Marquardt mask. Any questions so far? Louise, are you there?
Yep, I'm here, and we do have a question from Lee. Lee, I'll open up your microphone here so that go right ahead if you wanted to.
Please go ahead.
Okay, I was just thinking, shouldn't we include John Goodenough in the list of modern day geniuses? Because although, okay, he's the one that pioneered the first commercial lithium-ion battery. And I submit that some of these other fellows like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and some of those guys would not have been nearly so successful themselves without the basics of having that lithium-ion battery available for their devices, for their electric vehicles. And the only reason that John Goodenough didn't become wealthy like the others was that Oxford failed to patent his invention.
I'd love to hear more about that. Is there any way you can send me a little literature on that?
Actually, just listen to my my talk on the 19th to this class.
I look forward to that. I look forward to that very much. But I can really, my criterion to really recognize great genius is you have to give another 50 or 100 years after a person dies to decide how important they are. But the 5 figures I have define their fields. Leonardo defines well, he defines art and science as a pair.
Mhm.
He's quite the best in everything he did, the universal genius. Isaac Newton, Beethoven, they define their fields. So I haven't even included Michelangelo here, although there's no doubt he is a transformative genius. My biologist friends all say, why not Darwin? He certainly transformed our ideas about the life sciences, but more importantly, maybe it should be the DNA molecule.
Watson and Crick.
Yeah, Watson and Crick.
Crick.
Yeah, Crick, right. Frick is the museum in New York, Crick. But I thought all these characteristics of great genius would appear in the 5 characters I have. And one of them is this aversion to authority.
Mm-hmm.
But I look forward to your lecture.
Sure.
Very much. Okay, now this is a principle called the center line principle. In 1998, this made the front page of the New York Times. The Englishman, psychologist, art lover, Christopher Tyler discovered this principle in all the great portraits. I mean, really great portraits. If you draw a line right down the middle, it'll pass through an eye. And this particular array of 9 pictures appeared in black and white in the New York Times. In the Mona Lisa, the self-portrait of Rembrandt, Picasso's portrait of the Dora Maar. The line goes, the dollar bill, if you fold it right down the middle, it goes through George's eye. You can see right here. Picasso, if he knew the principle, would never have put the eye right here. He would have put it somewhere down at the bottom to be different. But didn't he, since no artist knows such a principle, they inadvertently or intuitively do this. This particular portrait of the old rabbi hangs in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and a pair of haggard-looking tourists are sitting in front of it without that life that the old rabbi seems to have, that Rembrandt has conveyed. Right through the eye. You see that? And there's Leonardo's self-portrait right through the eye. Incidentally, what I wanted to tie in with the Plato class today was that Leonardo used to say there were essentially the human body and the earth are 2 living organisms. I think the old Greek idea of a Gaia, living earth. And in his youth, well, let's see, he would have been in his late 20s by then, when he lived in Milan, he ventured he climbed the Dolomites and ventured into a cave where he found fossils of mollusks, of sea creatures. And he said, the church has been telling us that the world is only a few thousand years old. He says, at one time, these mountains were underwater. He said, either the seas went down in their level or the mountains rose from below the sea. That's my son when he got his MD, PhD at Hopkins. I looked at all the portraits we have in the family of single people, and there's my son with the line right through his eye. I suggest that you should take a picture of the portraits you have in your family, your homes, and see if you haven't taken the picture inadvertently. It has to be a single subject painting or photograph. In this case, this is a portrait of John F. Kennedy by Jamie Wyeth. Jamie Wyeth is the third in a series of three famous family painters. There was N.C. Wyeth, his son Andrew Wyeth, and then Jamie Wyeth. In the portrait of John F. Kennedy, he's put Kennedy off the center. That line certainly doesn't divide the canvas into two equal parts. Well, to my artist's eye, this appeared odd. I took a vernier caliper and measured very carefully, and this line happens to be 1 part to 0.618 parts. In other words, he's inadvertently or unwittingly taken the golden ratio and displaced JFK to the side. The interpretation he has, I've spoken to Jamie Wyeth since. He said he did it completely inadvertently, but it was to make him detached from the rest of us. He's figuring out what to do in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another principle that came out about the same time, this was in 1999, and this made the New York Times, but in the art section. Now, a young psychologist at the University of Melbourne by the name of Michael Nichol, made the discovery. He said, when he looked at the pictures of great portraits, there was always more left cheeks than right cheeks. So let me ask you, if you were posing for a picture, would you turn your head slightly to the right so you make the left cheek more prominent, or slightly to the right to make the right cheek more prominent? Rarely do you have a perfectly symmetric presentation. But here, he found, what he did was, he was wondering whether it was the artist asking his subject to pose in a certain way, or whether it was the subject posing in a certain way. Now, in Vermeer's case, for example, in his very few paintings, he painted only 34 paintings that we know of. In his portrait, he has one room, the light is always the same, coming from the left-hand side, where there's a prominent window. In the back, there's always a painting of an old map hanging on the wall, etc. His studio furnishings. But except for that light determining the way the sitter was made to sit, in most other portraits, he found there was a prominence of left cheeks over the right cheeks. So he put this to the test. He took a huge group of 200 students in a room. He said, we're going to create portraits of you, photographic portraits. He said, I'm going to take half of you out of this room and speak to the first half. Speaking to the first half, the 100, he asked them, he said, you're going to pose for a painting to hang in your girlfriend's house, or your boyfriend's house, or your mother's house. And immediately it became the left cheek. 78% of the time, the subject simply turned their face to the left. He brought the second group of students in. He dismissed the first group, and he prepared them. He said, we're going to have a photograph, a portrait taken of you. This is going to hang right next to Albert Einstein's portrait. Well, Albert Einstein, of course, is a certifiable genius. And this time, all the subjects turned their heads in the other direction, bearing their right. Now, the psychologists Mike Nichols and his collaborators at the University of Melbourne explained that this was because we emote on the right side, remember the creative right, and the right controls the left cheek. So if we emote on the right and we want to be endearing, we turn our heads slightly to the right, making our left sides prominent. We do mathematics on the other side, right above the ear, in the inferior parietal lobe. Einstein had a especially large section of that, it turns out. It turns out that after he died, his brain was kept by the pathologist, Thomas Harvey, in Princeton at Mercer County Hospital. He lost his job for keeping that brain, but he went back to Kansas where he originally came from. And 40 years later, when the news came out that Einstein's brain was still around, anatomists around the world wanted to see the brain, pictures of the brain, slivers of the brain. And what they found was Einstein was missing the parietal operculum here, where in the back, where we have speech. Late talkers often have small amounts of that parietal operculum. But the inferior parietal lobe had grown into that area, giving him an advantage, 15 to 20% greater area of mathematical gray matter, so to speak. Now, I come back to this painting. If you have any questions, please go ahead and save it for a minute. These are, in the case, Leonardo painted only 17 paintings in his entire life. The greatest painter ever, was parsimonious in his legacy in that sense. But Rembrandt painted himself. He painted 800 or 900 paintings, but he painted himself 97 times. It's an amazing diary of his maturation. I took these 6 slides of Rembrandt, self-portraits, spanning his 66 years, in his teens, in his 20s, and so forth. In this case, they're all with right cheek prominent, right cheek, right cheek, right cheek. This is left cheek. It's exactly the opposite of what we have with everyone else. So, was Rembrandt trying to impress with his intelligence? Any artist who does self-portraits knows the answer to this. You look in a mirror and it's reflected. The cheapest model you have is yourself, usually, if you're a portrait artist. So he was just painting himself the way he looked at himself. He wasn't trying to impress with his intelligent right cheek. He was trying to be endearing. It is 12:30. Please, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask me or write to me. I do look forward to that lecture on batteries, though. Here are 3 portraits by Leonardo. The only portrait by Leonardo, the only painting by Leonardo outside Europe is this. It's a square painting, Ginevra da Vinci. It hangs in the Washington National Gallery of Art. The fleshy part of the painting is in a golden rectangle. The center line passes right through the eye. The 3 paintings by Leonardo are called the 3 Sisters. 15 years later, he painted the mistress of Sforza. Her name was Cecilia Gallerani in Milan. Again, the line goes right through the eye. And in the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the world, right through the eye. This painting is a square and not a rectangle, it turns out, because sometime in the past there was a fire, it was damaged on the bottom, and the painting was cut right here. So it's now a square, 15.5-inch square. In the painting, one thing you find in the bushes here, also in the bushes here, are Leonardo's fingerprints. He was smudging the paint and the varnish with his finger. It's called velatura, the process of velatura, smoothing out the painting. And in 1992, when it was the anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus, the museums around the United States asked museums in Europe if they could borrow things made in 1492. This painting was made in 1492. The National Gallery of Art in Washington borrowed it from the Poles. The painting hangs in the Czartoryska Palace in Krakow. The painting came to the United States flying first class on Pan Am, and it was studied. They found that the background black was actually a BMW blue in Leonardo's day, but in the early 19th century, French painter painted over it and making it dark. It's actually more dramatic this way. But most importantly, right here in the neck of Cecilia Gallerani, they found the same fingerprints, Leonardo's fingerprints. Examining the painting, they realized that these fingerprints were the same, but they didn't have cameras that were fine enough to record those fingerprints. So they called the FBI, and the FBI came and took much better pictures of the fingerprints. So Leonardo da Vinci is now on file with the FBI. There are the fingerprints. Just before the pandemic, I was at the National Gallery with my granddaughter, and we did the same thing. I explained to the guard that I had written a couple of books on Leonardo, that I wanted to take a picture of. I gave him my card, a National Geographic card, and he allowed me to take close-up pictures with my iPhone. And with my iPhone 10, I could actually capture the fingerprints. You see them right there in the bushes. No questions so far? I don't see any.
No, and it is time for us to end for today with the fingerprints of Leonardo and the other geniuses all over our thinking about math and science and the arts. So I think it is a good time to wrap up and remind you that Lee Gasper Galvin will be talking about battery development on April 19th. I know you wanted to make sure you were there for that particular one. Next week for the class, we'll be looking at On the Back of Tortoises with Dr. Elizabeth Hennessy from UW-Madison. So any questions that people have after the lecture, we can relay them on to Dr. Atalay. If you just send them to Richard or to info@Plato-Madison, I'd be happy to make sure that Dr. Atalay gets your questions and can respond to you through email. Otherwise, I think that's it for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Atalay.
Bye-bye. Please call me Bulent. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.